Welcome to GeoHistory Files. Here, history isn't just remembered, it's investigated. Every empire, every war, and every political decision leaves a legacy that still shapes our world today. If you're new here, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Now, let's uncover the story they never wanted you to know. Israel versus Turkey. The Middle East New Cold War explained. On the 28th of June 2026, Israel did something it had refused to do for 70 years. Its government voted unanimously to recognize the Armenian genocide, the mass killing carried out by Turkey's own ancestor empire more than a century ago. For 70 years, every Israeli leader had buried it, deliberately to protect a friendship with Ankara. Now that friendship was worth nothing. In the dead of 1915, became a weapon. By July 2026, Ankara had struck back, calling Israel a burden on humanity, demanding sanctions, and snapping the last thin thread of normalization between them. This is the story of Israel and Turkey, two nations that once trained each other's pilots, shared each other's secrets, and stood side by side against the region around them. Two of the most powerful militaries the Middle East has ever produced. Their trade once crossed $3 billion a year. Their flags once flew together at the same military ceremonies. For a time, they were the closest thing this region had to a permanent alliance. That alliance is gone. Today, they watch each other across a broken country through the sights of a rivalry that grows sharper every month. Turkish warships now dock in Syrian ports. Israeli jets bomb the bases Turkey tries to build. Their leaders trade the words dictator and genocide in public in front of the world. And a single phone line, the last thread between them, is all that keeps their aircraft from meeting in the same sky over Syria. Not the cold hatred of lifelong enemies, not the open hostility of sworn adversaries. Something deeper, something more corrosive. The kind of rivalry that forms only when trust has been built over decades and then torn apart, piece by piece, until nothing remains but suspicion and the memory of the dead. This did not happen suddenly. It unfolded across 70 years, through genuine alliance, through slow erosion, through a single night of gunfire at sea, and through the collapse of a country that neither nation could resist reaching into. It is still unfolding right now. The only questions left are how deep it goes and how far it will reach. The world that no longer exists. To understand the present, one must return to a world that no longer exists. In the years after the Second World War, the Middle East was a landscape of new borders and old grievances. Empires had fallen. The Ottoman world, which had ruled these lands for 4 centuries, was dust. In its place stood fragile states drawn by foreign hands, uncertain of their own survival. 2 of these states did not fit the pattern around them. Turkey was not Arab. It looked west toward Europe, toward the alliance forming against the Soviet Union. In 1952, it joined NATO, planting itself firmly on the edge of the Western world. It was large, ambitious, and surrounded by neighbors it did not trust. Israel, founded in 1948, was smaller still and more alone. Surrounded by nations that refused to acknowledge its existence, it searched constantly for partners on the margin, states that shared its enemies without sharing its neighbors' hostility. In March 1949, less than a year after Israel declared independence, Turkey became the first Muslim-majority country to recognize it. The relationship that followed was never warm in public, but beneath the surface, it was real. Both nations feared the same things. Both were islands of a kind, non-Arab powers in an Arab sea. And in the logic of that era, the enemy of one's enemy was worth cultivating. For decades, the connection stayed hidden, spoken of quietly, conducted in the language of intelligence services and defense ministries. But it was strong, and in the 1990s, it stepped into the open. The high point. The 1990s were the high point. The Cold War had ended. Across the region, new alignments were forming. In Turkey, the military held enormous power over the state, and the generals saw in Israel a natural partner, modern, technological, unafraid. In 1996, the 2 countries signed a landmark military cooperation agreement. Israeli pilots trained in Turkish airspace, wide and open in ways their own crowded skies were not. Turkish fighter jets were upgraded by Israeli engineers. Intelligence flowed in both directions. Joint exercises brought their forces together, sometimes alongside the United States, in the eastern Mediterranean. Trade climbed into the billions. Tourists filled the beaches. Israeli companies modernized Turkey's aging tanks and aircraft. For a moment, it seemed that two of the region's strongest militaries had permanently joined hands, forming a northern axis that could shape the entire Middle East. Analysts wrote of a strategic alliance. Diplomats spoke of a partnership built to last generations. But this would not last, for the alliance rested on a foundation few noticed at the time. It was built by Turkey's generals, not its people. It was a partnership of institutions floating above a population that had never truly embraced it. And in the shadows, a different Turkey was rising. One that looked not west, but back toward a memory of empire, of leadership over the Muslim world. That Turkey was about to find its voice. The man who turned his name was Recep Tayyip Erdogan. He came to power in 2003, an outsider to the old secular establishment, carrying a vision rooted in political Islam and national pride. He spoke of a Turkey that would no longer wait at Europe's door, a Turkey that would lead, that would stand as the champion of Muslims everywhere, and above all of the Palestinians. At first, the old relationship held. Erdogan even mediated quietly between Israel and Syria, but the ground was shifting beneath the alliance, and the tremors were about to become a rupture. In late 2008, Israel launched a major military operation in Gaza. Erdogan was enraged. Weeks later, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, he turned to the Israeli president seated beside him and accused Israel of knowing very well how to kill. Then he walked off the stage. The moment was watched across the Muslim world. To millions, Erdogan had said aloud what their own leaders would not. He returned to Turkey a hero. The alliance was now openly cracking. And then came the ships, the night at sea. In May 2010, a flotilla of vessels set sail for Gaza, carrying aid and activists determined to break Israel's naval blockade. At its head was a Turkish ship, the Mavi Marmara. In international waters, before dawn, Israeli commandos descended from helicopters onto its deck. What followed was chaos. When it ended, 10 Turkish citizens were dead. The reaction was instant and total. Turkey recalled its ambassador. Military ties were frozen. The decades of quiet cooperation collapsed in a matter of days. There would be attempts to repair it. In 2013, Israel apologized. In 2016, the country signed a reconciliation deal. Ambassadors returned briefly, but something had permanently changed. The trust that had taken half a century to build was gone, and every attempt to rebuild it rested on ground that would not hold. The friendship was over. What remained was a wary coexistence, cold, transactional, and waiting for the next shock. That shock, when it came, would not come from the sea. It would come from a country to the south that was quietly falling apart. The country that broke that country was Syria. For decades, it had been ruled by the Assad family, first the father, then the son, Bashar. Their power rested on fear, on a security apparatus that reached into every home, on a minority regime governing a divided nation. It was brutal. It was stable. And in 2011, it began to break. The uprising that swept the Arab world reached Damascus, and the government answered it with force. Force became civil war. Civil war became a vortex that pulled in the entire region: Iran, Russia, the Gulf states, the United States, and both of the nations at the heart of this story. Turkey backed the rebels who sought to topple Assad, opening its border, sheltering fighters, taking in more than 2 million refugees who fled the collapse. It saw in the war a chance to shape a new Syria in its own image. Sunni, friendly, aligned with Ankara.
Target acquired.
Israel watched from the other side. For Israel, the war was not about Syria's future, but about Syria's dangers: the flow of Iranian weapons to Hezbollah, the presence of Iranian forces near its border. It struck when it saw threats, and otherwise it waited. For 13 years, the war ground on, killing hundreds of thousands, displacing millions. Assad survived, propped up by Russian jets and Iranian fighters. It seemed he might rule the ruins forever. Yet something had already begun to change. By late 2024, Assad's protectors were exhausted. Russia was consumed by its war in Ukraine. Iran was battered and stretched thin. And in the north, a rebel force that had waited quietly for years saw its moment. They moved south. City after city fell with a speed that stunned the world. Within days, the regime that had endured for half a century simply dissolved. Assad fled, and on the ruins of his rule stood a new leader, a former Islamist fighter once known by his war name, now presenting himself as a statesman. Ahmed al-Shara. Syria was open, empty of its old master. A vacuum at the center of the Middle East. And into a vacuum, power always flows. Two visions, one ruin. Two nations rushed toward that empty space. They arrived with opposite intentions. Turkey saw opportunity. Al-Shara's rise was, in large part, its own achievement. The rebels who took Damascus had grown in the shadow of Turkish support. Ankara envisioned a strong, unified Syria, rebuilt with Turkish money and Turkish weapons, governed by a leader who owed his position to Turkish backing. A stable Syria meant refugees could finally go home. A friendly Syria meant Turkish influence stretching to the borders of Israel and the Arab heartland. To Turkey, Assad's fall was a door swinging open. Israel saw the same event and reached the opposite conclusion. To Israel, the new government in Damascus was not a partner but a threat, an Islamist force with an uncertain future. Led by a man Israeli officials still refused to call anything but al-Jalani, his old fighter's name. A strong Syria, in Israeli eyes, was a dangerous Syria. And so Israel chose a different strategy, to keep Syria weak, divided, unable to threaten anyone. Within days of Assad's fall, Israeli forces moved into the buffer zone along the Golan Heights and beyond, seizing territory. Israeli aircraft destroyed what remained of the old Syrian military, its jets, its air defenses, its stockpiles so that no strong army could ever form. In the south, Israel reached out to the Druze minority, presenting itself as their protector, deepening the fractures inside the country. Here, then, was the collision. Two visions of the same land, one wanting it whole, one wanting it broken. Both willing to use force to get their way. The old alliance had died over Gaza. Now, over the corpse of Syria, something new was being born. The numbers of force. The numbers told the story of Israel's approach. In the first 7 months after Assad's fall, Israel carried out nearly 1,000 air and artillery strikes inside Syria, almost 3 times as many as it had launched in the previous 7 years combined. The targets were no longer only Iranian. Now they were Syrian, bases, weapons depots, the sinews of any future national army. And they were aimed increasingly at Turkey, for Turkey had begun to build. Ankara planned to establish military bases inside Syria, permanent installations that would anchor its presence for a generation. Turkish teams surveyed at least 3 air bases, choosing where to deploy their forces under a planned defense pact with Damascus. Israel struck those very sites. The message needed no translation. The bases Turkey wanted were reduced to rubble before a single Turkish soldier could arrive. It was the closest the two nations had ever come to direct confrontation. Not against Assad's ghost, not against Iran, against each other, by proxy on the ground of a third country, and both understood, in that moment, how easily an accident could become a war. A Turkish jet and an Israeli jet in the same crowded sky. A misread signal, a single shot fired in confusion. So they did something that revealed the true nature of this new age. They picked up a phone, the line between enemies. In the spring of 2025, Turkish and Israeli delegations met in Azerbaijan, a country friendly to both, to build what diplomats called a deconfliction mechanism, a permanent direct line of communication, a way to make sure that when their forces operated in the same Syrian skies, they did not accidentally kill one another. It was not peace. It was the opposite of trust. It was the machinery two enemies build precisely because they expect to keep clashing and wish only to control how. For Turkey, the arrangement was strictly technical, a precaution against accidents, nothing more. Ankara made its position clear. There would be no normalization, no warming, no return to the old days until there was a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. The rivalry would continue. The phone line simply meant it would continue without spiraling into open war. This is the strange shape of the new Cold War. Not tanks facing tanks, but delegations meeting in neutral capitals to manage a hostility neither side will end. Rivals coordinating their movements so that their rivalry does not kill them both. And around this fragile mechanism, The true contest went on quieter, deeper, fought not only with jets and bases, but with railways, weapons factories, and the slow construction of influence. The power to build Turkey understood something Israel did not fully grasp at first. The deepest kind of power is not the power to destroy, it is the power to build. While Israel bombed, Turkey constructed. Turkish Airlines returned to Damascus after 13 years. Turkish trade ministers set a target of $5 billion in commerce with the new Syria within 2 years, $10 billion within 5. Customs gates sealed for over a decade prepared to reopen. Turkish companies moved into the ruins of Syrian cities, and Turkish money began the long work of rebuilding what the war had destroyed. Turkey became the engine of Syria's new army as well. It sent trainers and planners. It prepared to supply drones, air defenses, precision missiles, the very capabilities Israel was working to prevent Syria from ever possessing. Syrian soldiers traveled to Turkey to train alongside its forces. For the first time in history, Syrian troops joined Turkey's largest annual military exercise. A Turkish warship sailed into a Syrian port on an official visit, a scene unimaginable only years before. And Turkey reached beyond Syria. It signed agreements with Saudi Arabia to revive an old Ottoman railway, a line that once connected Istanbul to the heart of Arabia, running through Syria and Jordan toward the Gulf. To the world, it looked like commerce, but its purpose was strategic, and Turkish officials barely bothered to hide it. A Turkish minister said it plainly: reducing Israel's influence in the region and binding these nations together would bring prosperity. The meaning was clear. Turkey was building an overland corridor from its own territory through Syria all the way to the Gulf, a route that would make it the crossroads of the region. And in doing so, it aimed to make Israel unnecessary, to route the future of Middle Eastern trade around the Jewish state, not through it. Israel had spent years positioning itself as the bridge between Asia, the Gulf, and Europe. Turkey was now building a bridge of its own, one that left Israel on the far bank, the arsenal. Behind all of this stood a transformation few outside the region fully appreciated. Turkey was becoming a military power in its own right, not a buyer of others' weapons, but a maker of its own. By the spring of 2026, its defense exports had climbed nearly a third in a single year, crossing $2.8 billion by June. It was building over 50 warships at once, and in June 2026 it sold one, for the first time, to a fellow NATO and EU member, Romania. Its drones had become famous on battlefields from Ukraine to the Caucasus, sought after around the world. And it was reaching higher still. In May 2026, Turkey signed the first production contract for its homegrown fifth-generation fighter jet, the KAAN, built entirely on Turkish soil to replace its aging American-made aircraft, with an export deal for dozens more already signed abroad. A ballistic missile with a range of 800 kilometers entered mass production. In that same month, Turkey unveiled something no one expected: an intercontinental range missile, with a reach of 6,000 kilometers, the first of its kind ever developed entirely within its borders. Piece by piece, across a single season, Turkey was assembling the arsenal of a great power. A nation that no longer needed permission. A military that could, if it chose, project force far beyond its borders, including toward Israel. Israel saw all of it, and it drew its lines. A permanent Turkish base south of Damascus, a red line. Advanced Turkish air defenses in Syria, a red line. For at the heart of Israel's strategy lay a single asset it would not surrender: the freedom of its air force to fly over Syria at will. Turkish air defenses would end that freedom, and so Israel made clear it would strike to prevent them from ever being installed. Turkey drew red lines of its own: a large-scale Israeli occupation of southern Syria, any move that threatened the survival of the government in Damascus. Cross these, Ankara warned, and the response would be direct. Two sets of red lines, drawn across the same small country, overlapping, contradictory, each side certain of where it would not yield. The wound, the rivalry, had spread beyond Syria's borders, into the deepest wound of the entire region. That wound was Gaza, and the war that had consumed it since October 2023. Turkey did not merely condemn Israel over Gaza. It went further than any other regional power. It cut off trade entirely. It closed its airspace to Israeli aircraft and its ports to Israeli ships. It declared that ties would not be restored until the killing stopped. Erdogan's language grew sharper with each passing month. And in June 2026, it reached a new peak. On the 10th of June, Erdogan told his party that Israeli strikes on Syria and Lebanon had reached the point where they now endangered Turkey itself, and he vowed to respond with force if Turkey's rights in the eastern Mediterranean were violated. Israel's prime minister answered by calling him an anti-Semitic dictator. The next day, the 11th of June, Erdogan compared the Israeli leader to Hitler, and Israeli lawmakers fired back, declaring Turkey an enemy state in every sense, a dangerous power dreaming of a restored caliphate, one that would pay a heavy price if the rivalry ever turned to open war. And beneath the war of words lay a harder accusation. On the 21st of June 2026, Israel's security services named 5 senior Hamas figures they said were operating from Turkish soil, recruiting fighters, moving money, directing attacks. Dozens of plots they claimed had been thwarted only by watching Turkey's Hamas branch. One of the named men said Erdogan had personally promised the group protection, telling them, "Just as we protect our own children, so we will protect you." Turkey did not deny its embrace of Hamas. To Ankara, the Palestinian cause was not a security file, but a matter of identity, of leadership over the Muslim world. Of the role Erdogan had claimed for himself since that morning, he walked off the stage in Davos. Here the two nations were furthest apart of all, not over territory or trade, but over the most fundamental question: who is an enemy and who is a friend? The weapon of memory. And then on the 28th of June 2026, Israel reached for a weapon it had kept sheathed for 70 years. For over a century, the mass killing of more than 1 million Armenians by the Ottoman Empire had stood as one of history's great crimes. And for 70 of those years, every Israeli government had refused to call it what it was refused, precisely to protect the friendship with Turkey. Recognition had been raised, debated, and quietly buried, again and again. The dead were left waiting, hostage to a living alliance. That alliance was now judged worthless. On that Sunday in late June, the government of Israel voted unanimously to formally recognize the Armenian genocide. Its foreign minister called it a moral act, a matter of justice too long delayed. "It is never too late," he said, "to do the right thing." It was framed in the language of conscience, but the timing revealed the truth. The recognition came as Israeli officials had begun, more and more, to speak of Turkey as the new Iran, the next great threat to be confronted. It came as Ankara waged a relentless legal and diplomatic campaign to brand Israel a criminal state before the world. And so Israel answered not with weapons, but with the past. It named Turkey's ancestor empire a perpetrator of genocide, a charge that struck at the very foundation of the Turkish national story. It was a card that could be played only once, and Israel played it. Ankara erupted. Within days into July 2026, Turkey called Israel a burden on humanity and demanded sanctions against it. The last thin thread of normalization snapped. The recognition still awaited final approval in Israel's parliament, a vote now postponed until after the country's elections in the autumn. But the meaning was already delivered, and it could not be taken back. The rivalry had passed a threshold. It was no longer only about Syria or Gaza or trade routes or airspace. It had become a contest over history itself, over whose account of the past would stand and whose would be used as a weapon against the other. Historical memory had become an instrument of statecraft, not to establish truth, to discipline an enemy, the line that holds. And yet, for all the fury, the two nations kept talking. Even as the insults flew through June and into July, the deconfliction line stayed open. Even as Turkey cut off trade, fuel still reached Israel through quiet roundabout routes. And a broader effort continued, an attempt, brokered by the United States, to build a security understanding between Israel and the new Syria itself. At the start of 2026 in Paris, Syrian and Israeli officials had met under American mediation and agreed to share intelligence and pursue de-escalation. It was fragile. It was incomplete, but it was a thread of restraint stretched across a widening gulf. This is the paradox that defines the moment. Two nations that call each other enemies, yet manage their enmity with phone lines and mediators. A rivalry fierce enough to weaponize a century-old genocide, yet careful enough so far to avoid the single spark that would set it ablaze. But the gap between rhetoric and reality is not stable. It is a tension held under pressure. And history offers little comfort about how long such tensions hold. Closing, consider what has been built and how quickly. A relationship that took 50 years to construct was destroyed in less than 20. An alliance of shared fear became a rivalry of shared ambition. Two nations that once trained their pilots together now calculate how to avoid shooting each other down. Two nations that once buried the past to protect each other now dig it up to wound each other. The forces gathering behind this Cold War are not the kind that fade. In a single season, the spring and summer of 2026, Turkey put a fifth-generation fighter into production, unveiled an intercontinental missile, sold its first warship to a NATO ally, and deepened its grip on Syria with every train, every base, every soldier. And in that same season, Israel bombed the bases Turkey tried to build and reached back 100 years to turn a genocide into a weapon. These were not the acts of nations drifting apart by accident. They were the acts of nations preparing deliberately for a longer struggle. Between them lies a broken country that neither controls and both need. Around them stands a region exhausted by war, watching two of its strongest powers circle one another. And above it all hangs the oldest truth of this land that power abhors a vacuum. And that when two forces rush to fill the same empty space, they eventually meet. They have not fought. Not yet. The phone line holds. The mediators shuttle between capitals. The red lines so far remain uncrossed. But red lines are only words until they are tested. Deconfliction fails. Accidents happen in crowded skies. And a rivalry managed is not a rivalry resolved. It is only a war postponed, waiting for the miscalculation that history has always eventually provided. The friendship of the 20th century is gone, and it is not coming back. What has replaced it is something the region has not seen before: two non-Arab giants, one building and one bombing, reaching for the soul of a shattered land, each now armed with the memory of the other's darkest hour. Time, as always, keeps its own counsel. It has watched empires rise on these same sands and vanish without a trace. It watched an alliance built and broken. It watched a nation refuse for 70 years to name a crime, and then, in the summer of 2026, name it the very moment naming it became a weapon. It watches now as two nations that once called each other friends prepare, quietly, for the possibility that they never will again. The line holds. For now.